So everyone, so just to present myself, I'm Renaud and I'm working at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, IDDRI, in Paris. And now we're going to go for a session about lessons from impact evaluation in the conservation sector and beyond. And we have two speakers to speak about it. First, we have Madeleine Bottrill from CIRAD. She's director at Monitoring and Evaluation. And then we have Philippe Davies from the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. So I guess we have two presentations of 20 minutes each, and we'll be very strict. There will be no extra time. And after that, we'll have discussion. After each presentation, we'll have discussion, and then we'll get an open discussion just afterwards. Thank you very much. So, Madeleine, if you want to start.
Thank you very much. Is that microphone working all right?
Yeah, it is now.
Okay, great. Perfect. Well, thanks everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers, Jan and Esteve, for inviting me to participate. This has been a really rich few days of discussion, and I've learned a lot from the case studies that were presented over the last 2 days, so I really appreciate the opportunity to come here. And I guess similarly to Nigel, who spoke this morning, I've very much gone through a thought process over the last 3 days, and I think this presentation has evolved. And I've sort of been revising the slides and trying to reflect some of the discussions and points that have been raised over the last couple of days as my thinking's changed. And I'm going to throw up a few ideas really, and I'd love some reactions from people. What I thought I'd cover in the next 20 minutes was I wanted just to sort of set impact evaluation in context of our broader monitoring and evaluation efforts at CI, and I'll introduce just a couple of case studies which we've already heard more detailed accounts of in the sessions over the last 2 days. And then I want to sort of think more about some of the lessons we've learned to date and challenges we've encountered and what that means for how we can integrate impact evaluation into our work. And I'm going to sort of throw out a straw man idea for a model for further impact evaluation and how CI might think about integrating impact evaluation further and adopting it. And then I guess I wanted to leave with a few opportunities, some ideas I had of maybe how this community, we might engage and collaborate in the future. So similar to Colby, we now have a requirement that we need to make sure we have people on all of our slides rather than just animals. And since several years ago, about 4 to 5 years ago, CI shifted our mission from a broader perspective from beyond biodiversity, but really trying to understand the contribution of natural ecosystems to human well-being. And as part of that mission, we really build on a foundation of science. A lot of CI's work is in partnership. We work with hundreds of different partner organizations, from local NGOs to research institutes and government agencies across the countries we work. And a lot of our work is around demonstrating in situ, in the field, different types of conservation interventions with the aim of sort of amplification and trying to achieve healthy, sustainable societies in the countries we work. And we work across a broad set of countries. We have offices in 25 different geographies, as well as partnerships and other projects in a further 60. And as you can see, it's primarily across, with an emphasis on tropical regions. So our model for implementation is based really around combining scientific innovation, which a lot of it emerges from the division in which I'm in, the Moore Center for Science and Oceans. And this is about trying to test new approaches, generate new data sets, and then working with policymakers and other types of agents of change, including the private sector, to amplify these initiatives into broader application. And I think this is where a real opportunity for impact evaluation could come in where we want to replicate and really demonstrating and sort of helping test some of the different design options that we have. So, and within these approaches is our overarching theory of change as an organization, that we implement interventions that sort of sustain or improve healthy ecosystems, and that these will generate ecosystem services upon which human well-being will sort of underpin. So trying to understand how ecosystems can benefit human well-being. And the systematic map initiative that I discussed in my poster presentation is very much trying to understand what is that causal relationship between ecosystems and well-being, and what is the role of ecosystem services in contributing and providing these assets that upon which vulnerable populations in particular rely. So our kind of slogan or tagline for a lot of our work since our mission shift has been people need nature to thrive. And because the focus of this discussion and workshop has been around forest conservation initiatives, CI has a vast array of different projects over our 25-year history that has involved forest conservation. These are just some of the examples of countries in which we work, from education in Sumatra, working with school students in understanding the way in which forests work, from conservation agreements in Sociobosque in Ecuador, as well as sort of traditionally a lot of the work that CI has done has been around understanding the baselines of biodiversity and using approaches such as rapid biodiversity assessments to identify what species are within certain parts of forest. There's just been a recent RAP in Suriname, which garnered a fair amount of media attention and a number of new discoveries to science. And increasingly, we've heard from some of the presentations a real interest in REDD+, and we are starting to do pilot projects across a number of countries, from Madagascar and Peru, for example. So this is just this isn't an exhaustive list of types of interventions that we do in forests, but as many as I can think of. And I guess it sort of represents the different roles that CI plays. So we can work both in sort of doing primary research, understanding forest status and trends, as well as we've had a long history of doing work in protected areas, both in supporting governments to establish protected areas, as well as helping communities manage those areas and doing restoration projects. We've talked a lot about payment for ecosystem services, and we've got a range of different types of work around that, as well as other types of incentive-based programs. And then also a number of different ways in which we work in forest policy, from community-level governance, and in particular we've been working a lot around rights-based approaches, involving communities and indigenous groups in decision-making, and how, what are the mechanisms needed to give people, these issues around equity and fairness in decision-making. And then, as Jonah described in his example, working a lot around international forest policy and also at national scales. So I won't go through all of this, but I think this really represents how CI plays many different roles. We're both a practitioner, we're also a donor, we do research, and increasingly we maybe are interested in being an evaluator as well. So a lot of my work since I joined CI 2.5 years ago has been trying to, with the mission shift, has been around identifying measures of success. And this is based around 4 components of CI strategy, which is based on sustaining natural capital, helping foster more effective governance systems, particularly at the national scale, then improving and more sustainable production practices and production systems, as well as really understanding that link between nature and people, and understanding human dependence on ecosystems and the extent to which people are benefiting from nature. So across these 4 components, we've identified a series of indicators, which I won't go into now because this isn't really the focus of this discussion, but would be happy to talk to anybody who's interested about the specific monitoring indicators we use at an institutional level. So more broadly, we use a range of monitoring and, to a lesser extent, evaluation approaches. And I'm thinking in terms of 5 different types of monitoring evaluation approaches based upon a paper that's just come out by Mike Marsha and co-authors that I'm also an author on, in which we've characterized different types of monitoring and evaluation approaches in these 5 categories, from status assessment to management assessment, and etc. So across these So I can't see very well on this slide because it's very little. There we go, I can see. So around status assessment, we've done a lot of work on monitoring systems in terms of understanding status and trends of both biodiversity and resource uses. And this is at different scales, from national and site scales, and we have a number of initiatives that people might be aware of, including our work in TEAM, the Tropical Ecological Assessment and Monitoring System, Vital Signs, which is a relatively new collaboration with the Gates Foundation, which is looking at agricultural monitoring across a number of African countries. So Michelle has been engaged in our work there in Rwanda, for example. I mentioned RAP, and then also recently the launch of the Ocean Health Index, which is looking at the status of ocean health, both at a global scale and now increasingly at national levels. Around management assessment, we've just last week have baseline protected area management effectiveness scores for all CI sites, which is a significant accomplishment for us. And this has been using the IUCN's management effectiveness tracking tool and the requisite MPA scorecard. So we now have a baseline in all CI sites of management effectiveness. So this will, hopefully we'll be updating this annually and tracking the effectiveness of management in protected areas where CI is engaged. As predictable, we do a lot of work around outcome monitoring, and I guess in terms of the evaluation component of that is more around reporting than what we would specifically call, a rigorous evaluation. And in terms of monitoring, this work I mentioned I've been doing on institutional metrics is around creating national dashboards for all of our programs, and this is combining information, tracking indicators annually across those 4 main components of our strategy. Our programs also spend a lot of effort on donor reporting and evaluation, and that's more around compliance than outcome or impact evaluation. For example, complying with USAID's performance monitoring plans and results frameworks. And then around outcome monitoring, we also have a lot of, our individual projects and sites are doing a lot of their own monitoring and collecting data, and that's more on, in terms of observational studies, and I'm trying to understand the effects. And then, as I mentioned in my poster presentation, we're increasingly starting to use tools such as systematic review and mapping. We've done a number of maybe non-systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but these will also inform our decision-making and generate information that we can use for monitoring and evaluation. But to date, there's been very limited application of impact evaluation. So, really among, this is, if you were going to try and look at the relative distribution, we'd have this huge amount of effort around both status assessment and around outcome monitoring, and it would be as tiny as a speck around impact evaluation, and also, around using systematic review. But this is maybe in conflict with the way that impact is communicated. So, for example, we celebrated 25 years of impact, and so there's, we talked a little bit yesterday about how there's sort of inconsistencies in the way that people talk about impact, particularly in communicating to donors and to the broader public about the work that NGOs do. And I spend a lot of time educating different people about words and meanings in monitoring and evaluation, and what is an outcome and what is impact, and it's used for different means. And so I think Philip raised a point yesterday about how impact's often really referred to around results-based reporting. So thinking now about our current perspective on impact evaluation and the experiences we've had today, as I said, CI plays many different roles. And so really around impact evaluation, we've had work, we've looked at work around using impact evaluation for research to inform broader policy and practice beyond just specifically what CI is doing, but what's interest to national and global policy and sort of key global initiatives. We've also used it, starting to use it and think about it in terms of measuring the impact of our programs and specific interventions. And then also, in terms of systematic review, is synthesizing evidence from existing impact evaluations to inform our work, to help us guide priorities and investments and understand, which interventions should we be using and how should we design them. So I'm just going to very lightly talk about a couple of examples So I'll just mention Jonah's work on the impact of Indonesia's moratorium on global emissions. And I just wanted to highlight another case study, which I won't go into detail, about how we might use some of the econometric tools that are associated with impact evaluation for also in research and work that Mark Steinager and Fabio Godoy and a number of others have been working on around modelling future land use change under RED. And this is trying to predict future deforestation rates and the distribution of deforestation and land use change in the absence of RED, plus in the future. So, and this is based on past and present forest cover. And so they've been doing quite a significant amount of analysis on RED, but I think it sort of relates to some of the topics we're talking here. And then also talking about the case study that Louise went into detail, which CI hasn't been involved in. And then just to highlight, but I won't go into, is we're also, the work that I mentioned in my poster on this upcoming systematic map. And there are a number of different meta-analyses and reviews that we've done on various interventions and processes, such as fisheries management tools. So I think I wanted to think about case studies in a slightly different way than those that have been presented the last 2 days. So people are very much focused on methods and sort of in talking about specific effects and results from those case studies. And I think I wanted to take a broader perspective and understand a little bit about, because we're talking about policy today, is understanding what are the types of interventions that we're doing as part of our impact evaluations, and understanding what has been the impetus for that evaluation, where does the funding come from, what has been the makeup of the project team, and some of the enabling conditions that allowed for that impact evaluation to occur. So understanding what are the processes that have enabled us to have an impact evaluation, and I think this is understanding some of the conditions for evaluation. And then I'll just briefly touch on some of the challenges and the uptake of evaluation results. So this is just based on Jonah's work. So the impetus of this has been, was the validation really claimed by this landmark policy. So there was a significant policy at the national scale in Indonesia, and it was really, and this is, was, purported to have a significant effect on the emissions reduction targets for Indonesia. And Jonah, you might want to elaborate on this in the discussion time, but the funding source has been the Packard Foundation and building upon existing grants and work that Jonah was already involved with an existing group of partners. And so the implementation agency for the moratorium was the Indonesian government, and CI was acting as an evaluator in terms of from a research perspective. And so just from my brief discussion with Jonah, we were just sort of talking a bit about what were some of the enabling conditions for exploring this evaluation. And that, and Jonah mentioned there was already existing data available from some of the modeling work that he's been doing using OSIRIS and other analyses. And there was also an established partnership with Woods Hole and other key collaborators, both in the research community and in the Indonesian policy context. And also CI had a role already in an established relationship in Indonesia as a trusted advisor, and sort of had been involved in Indonesia climate negotiations. So it was appropriate that we understood some of the context and were able to interpret the results within that context. And then in terms of the uptake of evaluation findings, I know Jonah's just now been presenting this work and will be, publishing it early in the new year, so that, in the peer review that will be out there, but, I'm sure there'll be a number of other mechanisms to distribute that information to key decision makers. So then in terms of the example from Louise gave with the social impacts of MPAs and the Bird's Head seascape, and this has been around an evaluation that WWF has led with UNIPA, the Papuan University, of a CI project. And so the impetus, as Louise mentioned, was this is part of one of the largest conservation grants, which is the Coral Triangle Initiative. And funding was primarily from the Walton family, and the implementing agency was, has been CI and CI Indonesia, and in collaboration with our local government partners. And WWF has acted as the evaluator. So some of the enabling conditions for getting this impact evaluation off the ground has been recognition by the donor that M&E was required, and the program officer at the Walton Foundation said that we should be allocating a minimum of 10% of our budget to M&E. And I think one of the things that helped this specific approach to the M&E of the program was framing the research on impact as part of better management, not just saying it was research for research's sake. And for us, it was involving an informed partner like WWF that we worked closely with in the region to conduct the evaluation, which I think both gives CI, gives the results greater impartiality, rather than if CI had led the effort and then reporting results, there would be issues about trust and bias if we were to lead that. But having someone like WWF that understands the context and that we can work closely with and to interpret the results, has many benefits for us. And as Louise mentioned, having collaboration with the local university, UNIPA, and hopefully this will help foster the uptake of the evaluation results. I won't go too much into the challenges because Louise covered those quite comprehensively, but obviously data availability and quality to establish baseline was an issue. And then also the expense of initial baseline monitoring, so there were some limitations about what could be done. And this is just from Keith Lawrence, who's one of our project leads in the Bird's Head, and I just asked him to reflect a little bit, and he was saying, there has been a lot of monitoring, but the data hasn't been hasn't been collected and sorted as it's come in, and it would be more fruitful for further evaluation if we could coordinate those efforts and really have. And so they've now hired someone to help streamline the monitoring processes, so there's actually the data sets are there to be used down the road. And then in terms of uptake of evaluation results, this is obviously still in progress, this evaluation, but I think by involving in-country researchers from the start, this hopefully will help these results to be used and then further replicated across the CPI in the future. So just in terms of some observations to date, just from these two brief case studies, and also from the discussion over the last couple of days, I've sort of thought about, there's a couple of things that I kind of came home to me, which is, we've talked a lot about protected areas and payment for ecosystem services, which often they can either involve a policy, quite an abrupt policy change or a legal mandate. And I think a lot of the work we do is around protracted implementation. So what does that mean for impact evaluation when the implementation of activities is happening over long time frames? And Louise highlighted this in talking about finding an appropriate baseline. When do we start measuring from? Is it from when a protected area is gazetted, or when it's actually implemented, or when there's actually some type of management activities on the ground? Nigel mentioned mismatches in timeframes and the disconnect between project cycle versus observed effects. We talked about issues about external validity. We are going to use these as pilot projects, and replicating them is knowing that these can be generalized. And again, just this point of impartiality, I think it's really important for CI to be able to have someone independent come in, but someone will be, but we also have a trusted relationship with. In terms of some operational observations, there's still a really significant gap in terms of existing M&E awareness and uptake. I just mentioned issues about vocabulary, but there are many other issues of getting people really understanding why monitor and the importance of it. And our technical capacity and expertise to implement impact evaluation. I am myself and one other colleague that lead M&E for CI, so we alone couldn't really manage an impact evaluation. So I think that really demonstrates there's a strong need for research and on-ground collaboration. But there are issues about being constrained by project funding, and funding for impact evaluation is often external to the project. So we really need to be building in either additional requests or really thinking about evaluation up front when we're writing proposals. And then there's obviously, we talked about political risk, there's significant political risk to doing this. And I think there's also, we need to think about the additional set of processes and mechanisms required for uptake. So I just wanted to, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into everything, but I wanted to just to think about, well, what is our third impact evaluation adoption? We have these assumptions that an organization like CI should integrate impact evaluation. And so we really want to measure, what is the benefit, particularly if it is a cost, both in terms of effort and also this institutional change about what impact evaluation can generate. And I just wanted to kind of leave this maybe as some ideas that I have for discussion, which is around an operational model for impact evaluation. So thinking about what we as an organisation might want to develop to really integrate impact evaluation. And we've talked about relevance as having relevant evaluation questions and thinking about anticipating policy windows of when impact evaluation would be useful to initiate and funding windows to resource this. And then also having an evaluation team, so strong collaboration with researchers and technical partners. And I would really like to see, coming from this meeting, of coming away with some agreements and people that we can work with to generate some proposals for impact evaluation. And I think this really needs a continuous partnership, so rather than just when an opportunity pops up, that we kind of reach out by email to a few colleagues that we know, but really having this more as a long-term relationship. And I think this is around, and I think this long-term relationship is needed because of the way that budgets for impact evaluation are available. Like, we need people involved in initial proposal development and able to respond quickly when opportunities come up, and sort of have things ready to go so that we can respond to these funding requests. And I think one thing I just want to emphasize, and we haven't talked too much about this, but it's really about closing the loop on impact evaluation, about how we get people to use evaluation results, and the importance of engagement of decision makers in the process, and also having a very explicit strategy around utilizing results and understanding what are the mechanisms for uptake and utilization, and thinking about that political risk. So if CI is going to do an impact evaluation of getting the mechanisms in place for our leadership to respond to those results and be able to make recommendations. So I'll leave it there for now, and I do have some slides around opportunities that I'd like to discuss with you, but maybe I'll use some of the time over lunch to chat with anyone who's interested. So thank you.
Okay, so we open the floor for discussion now, just for a few questions. For Philip, go for it. Okay.
Thanks, Madeleine. We had a few comments in the morning, people saying that implementers tend to don't like when evaluation finds negative or zero outcomes. So let's assume for 2 minutes that what you say now is going to remain this small group of trustable people. What does CI do when you find out that something really didn't work or did go wrong? And how does that threat, or does that threat in some way prevent you from collaborating with external researchers in doing your own evaluations? I'd just like to hear your opinion on that.
I mean, I don't think it dissuades us from, I think it's about, and in German is obviously with CI a lot longer than I have been, and might have some of his own sort of stories or anecdotes around this. But I think some of it is around CI having some ownership over the evaluation, and I think this is generally a point about evaluation, that there have been cases where there's been someone who's quite removed from the process who has come in and done an evaluation, and I think there can be two reactions: either ignore it and say that this person was not informed, or otherwise, I think, internalize it, but maybe not share that this. I think can be some case of not really taking on board the results, or maybe publicly talking about how they do it. We have had to respond publicly in the media to less than optimal results rather than failure. And I think one of the things I want to see, and one of the opportunities I was going to flag, is that we've just been awarded as an implementing agency of the GEF, and so we've been required to create an evaluation policy, which I'd be happy to share with anybody. And a lot of the evaluation for the GEF is around compliance, but I think it also sets up some of the mechanisms that we need that we don't currently have, which is about having an executive group that needs to respond to the results of external evaluations. And with the GEF, you have to make your evaluations publicly available online, and so that anybody can then see the results of those evaluations. Whereas I think in other cases they've not really been public in that way. And I think that will help in terms of us being able to integrate this into how we do maybe an adaptive management.
Thank you, Madeleine. Wonderful presentation. I have three quick questions. One is on the management scorecard. I'm kind of curious about the procedure. I mean, who assesses and who is assessed in that management scorecard? Then the other question is maybe about what you do, or maybe about what you would do in the future, I don't know, depending on your answer, which is in a complete different context with a PhD candidate that works with me. We've looked at changes in labor allocation within households as a result of, in this case, getting involved in oil palm plantations as laborers. So I wonder whether CI has in mind, or you've already done it, explore what are the implications, intra-household implications of getting involved in a conservation project, and therefore who bears additional labor burdens which often fall on women. And therefore we often ask the male who benefits from the conservation because he gets employment or whatever, but we don't ask what the woman thinks about it. So I mean, some reflection on that. And then my last comment it's not so far a question, but a comment. Here I'm going to play the environmental activist role, which is something that we did not discuss in this workshop. It's obviously, probably it's beyond the boundaries of this workshop, which is this question about when we look at impact, where are the boundaries of where we're looking at? What I mean by that is that we know that protected areas and other forms of conservation in countries where there is a lot of pressure on land, when there are claims about land rights, I mean, they are socially contested projects, and they are socially contested interventions. So it may be very well that in our impact evaluation everything looks nice and we are protecting the forest and we look at the subgroups and it seems everything is fine. But then there is a strong social movement in the region against the creation of that. And there are some valid reasons of why that's the case. I mean, recently in Chiapas, a social movement alone has been able to cancel the agreement between California and Chiapas about the implementation of future RED pilots in which CI is involved. So I mean, your reflection on how CI deals with these broader social movements and opposition to your work. Thank you.
Thanks. All good questions. I mean, I'd be happy to go into more detail about the management scorecard, but just briefly, we're using this, established scorecard, and it's in terms of who assesses it. We normally get the managers in the field to work with park managers. So normally, as a kind of a stakeholder meeting, that they would fill out the scorecard together, and the assessment. I mean, I can go through the questions maybe offline in the lunch break about what we cover. And then in terms of thinking about gender, we certainly have a number of colleagues who think more specifically about the gender roles, and I'm very much interested in this issue of equity and understanding who benefits. And I think, this is something that's a growing area and that we need to think more about in our indicators of how, disaggregated indicators and how we meaningfully get that both in the design of our projects and then how we measure the work that CI does around gender. So happy to share our gender policy with you as well. And then in terms of understanding kind of maybe the broader social movements, I think that's a really important point, and I think a lot of what my interest is that I've talked about with the systematic map is understanding both positive and negative impacts of conservation on human well-being, and we've focused a lot, particularly strategically, around how people benefit from nature, but I think we also need to be very aware of the effects of conservation on governance, and that conservation is one management unit within a broader socio-political context. And so being aware of those impacts, and I think the systematic map will be one way, but I think also having these specific case studies of putting protected areas and safeguards is something we're very interested in too. So thinking about that definitely. I'll let you choose.
Thanks very much. I was just thinking at the upper end of the scale of Esteve's question, really. But if we look at the sort of the global picture, CI has been having 25 years of impact, FFI has been having 100-odd years of impact, and so on. And whilst we don't have a counterfactual in a sense, what we can see is sort of global scale that the sort of trends for biodiversity are not terribly good. So in some respects, what you could say is that there's a lot of bad news coming out there. And I just wondered, for organisations like yours, you obviously make decisions about what kind of approaches you take. Do you back market-based approaches? Do you get into bed with industry? Do you do this, that, and the other? And I wonder, do you have that sort of high-level policy sort of discussion, evaluating the kind of strategy that you adopt? I'm probably not using the right word.
No. I mean, it's a good point, and it's actually a specific area of interest for me, which is about trying to understand the benefit of different actions, both in terms of the costs of doing different interventions and the probability of success, and how we choose different interventions are very much what my interest is in an evaluation, is how we can then feed that back into how we prioritize the allocation of our resources to what interventions are going to work. Because I think, and a lot of the discussions I have with our project teams is when I get people to go through theory of change exercises, and people always start with the intervention and then they assume it's going to have this particular outcome, whereas I'm trying to get people to flip it and start with the outcomes and what they want to achieve, and then map back to the intervention, and is that really a causal relationship? So, I mean, on a project level, I'm thinking about that, but certainly, we need to think about, synthesizing what evidence is out there about what policies are working across, all the organizations that are applying them at a global scale, and knowing what works, which I think is, why we're interested in evaluation, or what everyone in this room is. I guess on your original context around, maybe I'm an optimist of saying maybe the declines in biodiversity would be worse, that the trend line would be steeper if we hadn't been involved. But, yeah.
One last question? Thanks. Just to reflect maybe a little bit on Jan's question, and then to put in a big plug for working with CI and WWF, other conservation organizations. So I think there's, so when does CI or organizations like CI respond well to impact evaluation, and when don't they? And I think the distinction is when you're looking at large scale, at the scale of big interventions that are commonly used, like protected areas, versus somebody's individual project that they've poured their life and their career dreams into. So on the first, I would just like to point out that sort of the ancestor, the progenitor of much of the work that we do now originated with CI. So Börner et al., 2001, in science, our protected area is effective. And this was well before matching. It was very crude, counterfactual, looking at parks and their immediate buffer zones. It was based on survey data because there wasn't this type of satellite data we have now. Just asking park managers to compare the results inside and the immediate outside of the protected areas. Last time I checked, 900 or 1,000 sites on Google. And so CI is interested in knowing broadly, do protected areas work? Does pest work? Or can pharmaceutical revenues be used to save rainforests? Is ecotourism effective? And the science-based and the mission, they do respond to what research says about what is and isn't effective. But then you contrast that to looking at our individual initiatives, working or not, and I think you've heard, some of the reasons why the incentives aren't aligned to knowing the answer to that question. If a conservation organization pours their heart and best effort into one initiative in one place, and it's a spectacular failure, they would just as soon brush it under the rug, learn their lessons, take their lumps, and move on. They don't see a benefit to having that splash across the news. If it's working, if they think it's working, if the people around them think it's working, they'll be able to amplify that, convince people without, the highest form of impact evaluation. So I think that's maybe where the distinction is. And then to put in a plug, so I did work for Conservation International for 8 years, and it's a tremendous organization, both in terms of
implementation and research. It spans that spectrum. And I would, I would say what Madeleine said about the building long-term relationships is very important. So I would, sometimes these relationships start with a project, but people work with the people they know, and if you go to Madeleine or someone else from CI or someone else from WWF, Colby, and say, this is what I'm interested in, can you connect me, let's look for opportunities together. The thing in Indonesia happened because CI Indonesia had a 25-year history with the people in Forest, the government there. And so it was just standing on the shoulders of giants, who laid the groundwork. And so you get that. You don't have to build a relationship from the start when you work with CI or an organization like that. So maybe I'd like to ask a question to Madeleine. What are the opportunities to work with CI? Do you have a slide you can show on that?
Yeah, I have a couple, but maybe I'll just summarize what they are. I mean, I think there's opportunities in terms of interventions that we might look into doing impact evaluation. And I'm actually thinking one of my next, is it off the microphone? I don't know. But I was thinking one of the next steps I want to do going home after this workshop, some homework I want to do is look and do a review of our current interventions and projects and maybe identify which are the ones that are most suitable for impact evaluation. That'd be great to kind of then feedback to this group about what I've come up with. And then also some data sets. So I mentioned the management effectiveness work. We also have lots of these monitoring systems that we're implementing, so those could be really useful for people to integrate into, such as we have over 1 million camera trap images from the team network, for example, which could be really exciting to include in an impact evaluation. And then again, I talked more about institutional opportunities, which is around this work with, we're now as an implementing agency of the JEF, and how that might work. They're interested in evaluation as well. So yeah, happy to chat over lunch with anybody.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, for fairness reasons, we have Philip.
That's what?
Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a wonderful group. It's been a refreshing experience for 3 days, 2.5, 3 days, to just work for me outside the field with very bright people. I love doing that, and thank you very much. I want to thank Vanessa, who really got me here, and hopefully is going to get me back tonight. There's been a slight travel problem. I've learned that if you come to a conservation conference, you have to get nice pictures, and I didn't have any. But I was at a conference in Banff in Alberta recently, you'll recognise it, and it is sort of relevant because they've actually dug out of a beautiful forest a conference centre which is sublime. And I was just thinking last night what damage they've done to the local ecology. The benefit is it's also an arts centre, so you get very fine arts there, and I was trying to monetise the arts value that you get doing that. So that's where that is. A much more important picture is this one. Why average treatment effect is unimportant and why outliers matter. Now this gentleman here is called Fernando Torres. He plays for Chelsea and his average treatment effect is close to 0. He cost us £50 million and he scored about 9 goals in about 2 years and is utterly useless. However, there was 1 goal he scored against Barcelona 2 years ago in the 94th minute, which made me the happiest man on earth. I have a video of Puyol chasing him down the pitch, and it's just sublime. So outliers do matter, even though average treatment effect, he can go tomorrow to Atletico, where he came from, but actually he's a very nice young man. I shouldn't speak ill of him. Okay. Now the challenge that the team set me was, How has impact evaluation culture developed in the international development sector generally, and something like lessons learned, mistakes made, and how we might make evaluation culture stronger. So I'll try and do that, but I came with 14 slides and it's now 29. So I will stop when you show me the sign and let's get going. What is to be evaluated? Well, first of all, we talked all week about clearly what works, the intervention effectiveness. We've also talked about implementation effectiveness, how it works, why it works, under what conditions does it work. We need both, and they count as impact evaluation. We've talked about diversity effectiveness, for who does it work, and that's very important. And also when does that work? We talked in a group yesterday about the impact isn't just on the poor, but on the very poor and the extreme poor, and we often don't get those data sufficiently precise. And then there's experiential effectiveness, users, people, citizens' views of the world, which we ignore that at our peril. And resource effectiveness, where we need good cost-effectiveness studies, cost-benefit studies, which, by the way, are noticeable by their absence from nearly all evaluations, not only in the international development literature, but in evaluation period. I'll just tell you a little bit about 3IE, in case you don't know what we are. The 3 I's is the International Initiative for Impact, and the E is evaluation. So we do impact evaluation. More specifically, we fund impact evaluation and we support people technically to do this. So the work we've done this week is what I call talking dirty, is what we do for a living. We talk dirty to people about impact evaluation, how to do it, how to get effect sizes, how to randomize, how to match, and what have you. But we fund that and we support it. We also do systematic reviews of evidence, which is actually the area of 3IE I'm responsible for, and that's important. And in both the impact evaluation side of our work and systematic reviews, we cannot find good cost data, cost-benefit data. So we're building models, standardized models that we're running against some of the impact evaluations and the SRs that we get. So that translates into what are we doing in national development sector? Theory-based evaluation, which is that how is this policy, this program, this initiative supposed to work? Impact evaluation, sometimes called summative, which is, well, does it work? Or if you're doing ex ante, will it work? Or if you're going to do it post, has it worked? And then we need process, formative evaluation, which goes to the how, why, and under what conditions. And something that we're calling developmental evaluation is building the evidence base over time. And this is something I want to move on to. I put this in last night after a discussion over dinner. We need to distinguish between building a strategic evidence and operational evidence. What I think this group's got to focus on, if I may suggest, is you've got to think about the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You're building an evidence base. And that's where things like impact evaluations using randomization and the QEDs come in handy, because you've got time. You need to think about 3, 5, 10 years. Okay? That's thinking strategically. So that when we get to 2020, 2025, we have an evidence base. That's precisely what we've done in medicine and public health. We started doing this in 1990 with the Cochrane collaboration. We now have a huge evidence base, 5,500 systematic reviews and thousands of impact evaluations to help us make better decisions. But that's doing our work strategically. The discussion we were having this morning was largely about doing operational evidence, which frankly you're not going to influence, not very often. It's very hard to influence policy in real time, okay, unless you've got that evidence base there, that you can pull out and you can put it into practice. So please, we need to think about our work. We can work on both levels, but it's much harder at this stage, I think, of international development status to really work much at the operational level, and don't be pushed into doing it. Think of the long term, and that's very important. So we need to ask, what is the question? Now, I'm an academic, 20 years at Oxford University, but I went to work in the Cabinet Office in Britain and went to work in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. So I'm also played both sides of the fence. I'm an evaluator, and I'm not a policymaker, but I advised policymakers on how to use evidence, and that's crucial. Not how to do evidence, that's what we do. They have to use it. There are 7 questions that I've learned that I think dominate the policy process. And I'll use our language. First of all, in the blue call-outs, how is this policy supposed to work? We now ask policymakers to ask that from the outset, because policy starts way upstream. It starts with manifesto commitments. It starts with slogans that are dreamt up by political parties that have no evidence base to them at all. So we're going to privatise, we're going to nationalise, we're going to environmentalise, but they don't really have a policy. So you have to say to them, well, how's this supposed to work? And that's where our theory of change comes in. We build a logic model. And last week, I was in South Africa just before Mandela died, and I was in the Mandela Rhodes Hotel. I was staying there, and on the wall there was this wonderful quote by Mandela: "Thinking is one of the most important weapons in dealing with problems." And I have a version of that, which is evidence-based evidence is no substitute for thinking-based evidence, and we don't think enough. So we need to put a lot of time up front into building how a policy is going to work. What activities, mechanisms, I'm trying to pull together what we've said this week. What people have got to be in place? What's the sequence? Can we build a causal chain? What resources are required? And above all, what are available? And that's where the cost element comes in. What data are required, both quant and qual? And what data are available? And we need both sociological, anthropological, ethnographic data, as well as numeric quantitative data. And sometimes when we're building policy in a good strategic policy team, we say, this policy is not ready to go. This program cannot run. We hold, wait, do something else. We have something else to do. But evaluations like that, I've often advised that we don't do an evaluation because we don't have the data. We don't have a clear model of how it's supposed to work. So deciding whether we should even evaluate is where the theory of change comes in. Then, second question, what do we know about a question or an issue? And this is a sell for the systematic reviews movement. We need to harness the existing evidence. If I take anything for these last 2 days, I've heard about 20 studies that can contribute to a systematic review of what we know. We've got to pull it together. What we're trying to do in the systematic review movement is to stop the culture of the latest study has shown, which is terribly dangerous. The latest study has shown doesn't tell us much at all. It's the latest study. Okay? It's when you put it together with the last 30 studies, 50 studies, 100 studies, you start getting the generalizable, the signal, and you start getting the noise. You know what is generalizable and what is context specific. And just some of the tricks we have for that, I can't go into this in the time available. Statistical meta-analysis, which to me is the most powerful tool we have in the box, where we pull together 20, 30, 100 studies and work out an overall cumulative point effect size with confidence intervals. This is powerful. They take a long time. Look how long they take, 6 to 18 months minimum. When we can't do that, we do a narrative systematic review. To go back to Alex's point, we tell a story. What do these 20, 30 studies tell us? And they're just as important. When I was in government, I couldn't get anybody interested in this because they said, Phil, you've got between 1 and 13 weeks to summon the evidence. So I started doing rapid evidence assessments. I do exactly what's in the top 2, but I do it in 13 weeks. You cut corners, you economize, you're as rigorous as you can be. Unfortunately, with modern data searching, you can be pretty rigorous. We managed to do these rapid evidence assessments and then went on to develop a more systematic review of the evidence. Sometimes you can just provide an evidence map, and by gosh, you guys are good at mapping, wow. But I mean mapping of the evidence. And that includes these things called gap maps, which I'll show you in a minute. When you actually plot from systematic reviews all the evidence we've got, you not only show what we know, but more importantly, you show what we don't know. It's called the Donald Rumsfeld principle, if you know what Donald Rumsfeld said about that. And then we need meta-ethnography, meta-qualitative studies. They're just as important, okay? And it's a whole field of specialism, how to synthesize qualitative studies. So we find out, again, they use a different language. They say, what is the metaphor? What is the principle? What is the ethos? That's the language. They don't talk about validity. They don't talk about point effect sizes because they're not relevant. They have a very different language, but it's very important and helpful research. Now that, my friends, is a gap map. This is the gap map on HIV/AIDS. We're developing one on climate change and one on agriculture. On the axis here, we have the interventions, and on the other axis, we have the outcomes, okay? All we've done is we've mapped the systematic reviews that we've got. The greens are high quality, high confidence evidence. The yellows, if they come out yellow, are moderate, and we quantify that. And the reds are low quality, and the blues are protocols. What is interesting about that map to me isn't what we know, it's the gaps, it's what we don't know. And that's why we're using these to start prioritising where we put primary research and primary evidence. So look out for our gap maps, particularly our ones that will interest you on climate change, and please help us do them, because you know this stuff better than we do. Third question, what is the nature of the problem? What's the size of the problem? What's driving it? Okay? We miss the point. Often the problem isn't a problem, and it's not a big problem. Or it's not a big problem yet, but it is going to be 10 years down the line. So that's simply using survey data, census data, administrative data, qualitative research, and to show you I've been listening, pixels and polygons. I can even use the language. Because you have ways of capturing this that is very important, and by the way, very effective. I do know that work because we do it quite a lot with the index of multiple deprivation, where we map areas of deprivation using a very similar methodology. But only then do we come on to what we've been calling the impact evaluation this week. Okay, then we come on to, well, what works? What works is only relevant once you've done these other three questions. Then you say, well, we need a randomized controlled trial, or we need a QED. And we've covered all these this week. I'm not going to go into them. For people who haven't been here, you've missed a real firecracker. We didn't talk much about interrupted time series design, a very weak design, but sometimes it's all we've got when we're working with data in certain areas, particularly in public health, and possibly I would think in environmental studies. Fifth question, or is it the fourth, is then how do we implement this? How do you get it to work? This is what I call implementation evidence. Somebody mentioned during the week we talk about implementation science now as a discipline, where we try and, it was Paul, we actually try and randomise or QED the interventions so that some people get it in one way and others get it in another. But we need to supplement that with case studies, with interviews, with focus groups, with ethnography, with operations research, which in government is one of the most important tools we've got. These are the guys who break down a policy issue down into constituent parts, into the theory of change, and operationalise it, and identify what's got to be implemented in a sequential way. Next question, what's the cost of this? And I repeat, without cost data, impact evaluations are as good as useless in policy and practice. You're not going to get it through the Treasury or your finance department until you've got a cost structure. And without it, it really is useless. So you've got to start building cost analysis, and then you can do cost benefit, cost effectiveness, and cost utility analysis. Which is what I put there. I'm skipping on because I want to make one other point before I hush up. And this area, I think it goes to what Adrian said at the beginning of the week. There's another type of evidence, which is good, I can do that. Another type of evidence, which I call ethical evidence. And it's about, when we're doing impact evaluations, we're doing trade-offs. We're saying, what if we did A versus B? But A versus B is often trading off one sector of the society over another. And we are revealing our preferences about that sector over the other. And I do it a lot, for instance, with the elderly and small babies. People always want to build facilities for small babies, particularly very small babies. But they're not that interested in building facilities for the very elderly. And if you do an actual impact analysis, you get a much better impact investing in the elderly than in the babies. A much better bang for your buck. But nobody wants to do that because it reveals a very different set of societal values, that we value babies a lot more than we value oldies, okay? And we do that by using various forms of public consultation, something I'm working on with some colleagues at Oxford, social ethics analysis, which tries to understand what are the principles by which we make judgments of fairness and equity and so forth. So that, as you see, my friends, it's so simple what evaluation is about. It's a walk in the park. No problem at all. It is what I call the gestalt of impact evaluation, and it gets us away from just arguing about RCDs versus QECDs versus Ferranda Torres not scoring goals. It's much more important that we try and address these issues. So my lessons learned are, theories of change are important. I think I've beaten that to death. I'm not going to say any more about that. Second, counterfactual evidence is important. For those who weren't here during the week, that means it's nice to know what would happen with and without the intervention. We need to establish this important value of the net effect over what we would do if we did something else. And by the way, the net cost would be helpful as well. And we have a range of evaluations. We've pretty much exhausted the toolbox this week, but there are very excitable ways we can do this. You're not hidebound to a randomized trial, to a PSM, to a DID. There's lots of things we can do, and we must use them appropriately. That's the most important thing. And I think that's probably so for the area of, I've certainly learned this week, conservation evaluation. You're doing it. But more importantly, we need more and more of these evaluations, but can I make a bid for high quality evaluations? Because we're learning from the systematic reviews movement, majority of our work in international development doesn't get anywhere near the standards of quality I think we've been talking about this week. Oh, this is important. Louise mentioned this, nobody else did. Statistical power is important. It is very important. Underpowered RCTs are not very helpful, okay? Underpowered anything aren't. So power is important. It's not just a question of how we do the allocation bias. Third, lessons learned, systematic reviews really are important for these reasons. They establish what we know and what we don't, Donald Rumsfeld. It helps us establish the balance of evidence. It gets us away from this latest policy, the latest study has shown. It tells us about the strength and the quality of evidence. We hold evidence up to very high quality thresholds. A criticism of 3IE is we put the standard too high, so things are failing. And we take a lot of flack for that, which is why we actually have our green, amber and red. We actually go down to the low quality evidence. My colleagues in the Cochrane collaboration say if it goes below that threshold, it's out. It's not evidence. And that's a debate to have. Where do we put that threshold? It helps us know where we've got to do our primary impact evaluations. It helps us determine what's generalizable and what is context and culturally specific. And it gets us into these mechanisms that Paul led our discussion on. The mechanisms out there in the real world by which policies are delivered, they fail, they succeed, and so forth. And for that we need often really good meta-ethnography. Not just going out and getting the numbers, we need to find out why they failed and under what conditions they were to succeed. Now this is a systematic review 3IE is just about to publish on PES and decentralized forest management. It's going to now be January because I read the email last night, it's got held up yet again. And what the questions were basically to what extent do conservation and poverty reduction goals conflict? We've been discussing that this week. How do different conservation strategies fare in terms of trade-offs? And is there a win-win? Can you get both? What I want to take you to is they started out with 1,392 studies and they landed up with 11 that were included. Only 11 quantitative experimental, quasi-experimental studies were included, only 9, qualitative studies. Now that's a lot of those thousands because they were not within scope. But you will see 125 of them, they just didn't make the cut in terms of scientific quality. And almost identical for the DFM work, okay? We need to debate that. Are we cutting out too much evidence by holding the bar too high? All I would say about this, there's just a low quality of evaluations, poor methodological quality. What's the problem? They didn't find a single acceptable RCT. They found RCTs, but they wouldn't include things that were done badly. Poor matching, lack of exogenous independence, lack of attention to spillover, all things we talked about this week, and just bad, inadequate reporting of standards, errors, and confidence intervals. Statistical reporting is just badly reported. This, by the way, is a message to editors. Get your acting gear. You're publishing a lot of nonsense across the piece. We used to do this in medicine. We don't anymore. We cleaned our act up. But a lot of the social science and political science stuff is just rubbish. Okay, and I've published a lot of it myself. Okay, same with the DFM stuff. And lastly, what we've been discussing this morning, getting policy into practice, evidence into policy into practice is important. Dissemination, my friends, is not enough. You can send your papers where the heck you like. You can publish as much as you like. That is not dissemination. Well, sorry, it is dissemination. That's not getting evidence into policy. You've got to get early engagement with policymakers and practitioners. We call it front-loading. So we front-load the questions that we asked and what the issues are. Practitioners and policymakers often have a better idea about what are the issues. And we often rather, I think, arrogantly think that we have a better idea of it. Also, we haven't discussed this week, who the heck are policymakers? They're politicians, well, don't count them, they're not even in the game. They're largely civil servants, which is about 10 classifications of civil servants who do policy making. Okay, and you've got to find the right one. Okay, and you've got to get up the policy tree. But then there are people at the local level. There are people who run in the village pump who are policy makers. There are people who run NGOs that are policy makers. And they're not the same, and they've got very different evidence needs and very different evidence understanding. So please, let's find out what are the interpersonal networks, the conduits through which we will work. I was saying to Jordi at dinner last night, often I go through the chief scientist at DFID or the chief scientist at Save the Children. I try and get to people who policymakers listen to. They don't tend to listen to academics. They don't, frankly, like us very much, and we speak a weird language. So they don't want to speak to us, but they may want to speak to conduits in between. And I played that role for 7 years, that conduit role. And it also needs active management. You work the hell out of evidence. You work it just as a PR person works nonsense, okay? And there's this new industry called knowledge brokering. DFID now has a team of knowledge brokers whose sole work is to work the evidence in government. So you need to get into that knowledge brokering setup if you want to get evidence into policy and practice. You've got to get them to trust us. They don't, partly because we often ridicule them and show them how stupid they are, and it's reciprocal. They often say some very nasty things about us. If you want a very nice read, we published a document called Analysis for Policy when I was in the Cabinet Office. We interviewed 60 of the top civil servants in Britain, and you wouldn't believe what they said about researchers. It's almost unpublishable, so we published it. We are the last port of call they go to for evidence. There are much better and more effective providers of evidence than us. And we've got to combat those. These will be lobbyists, pressure groups who use evidence selectively. They use wrong evidence, but they're very good at getting into policy and practice. So we've either to get like them, or we've got to use them and exploit them. But we were very low on the, I say we, the academic community, very low on the pecking order for getting evidence into policy and practice. I'm not going to conclude, I've said it all. That's who I am.